All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're tackling a topic that can be really challenging, but it's also incredibly important: the intersection of our faith and our mental health. We're going to walk through a biblical framework drawn from the work The Contested Mind that offers a really different and, I think, much richer way to think about our inner struggles. When it comes to mental health inside the church, it often feels like the conversation gets stuck in one of two extremes. On one side, it's all just biology, right? The brain is a machine, it's a chemical imbalance, and that's the end of the story. But then on the other side, it's all spiritual warfare. Every single bad thought is a direct demonic assault. But are those really the only two options on the table? The source material we're looking at today argues, pretty compellingly, that there's a much more complete picture.
So, here's our game plan for unpacking this. First, we're going to diagnose the problem, what the source calls a crisis of categories. Then, we'll look at the solution, which involves recovering a lost biblical worldview. After that, we'll see how this worldview actually works in layers, what it means for us practically, and finally, how it totally reframes what we think of as hope. Okay, let's start with that first point, this crisis of categories. The core problem that's being identified here isn't just that people are suffering. We know that. It's that we often don't even have a good way to talk about that suffering within a biblical framework that makes sense. And this brings us right back to those two extremes. You've got psychological reductionism, which basically says everything is just brain chemistry and neurons firing. Any talk of the spiritual is just, pre-scientific nonsense. Then you have spiritual sensationalism, which sees a demon behind every corner and can sometimes totally ignore the very real physical things that cause us to suffer. The argument here is that both of these views just flatten out a reality that the Bible presents as being way more complex and interesting. So, if both of those ways of thinking fall short, what are we left with? Well, that brings us right to our second section, recovering a worldview, a third way of seeing things that was actually pretty common to the biblical authors, but has kind of gotten lost to many of us today. The heart of this alternative is a concept called the divine counsel worldview. Now, this is a really crucial idea. It's not about a bunch of gods competing with the one true God. Not at all. It's describing a reality with multiple layers that all exist and interact at the same time. You've got the divine layer, the human layer, and the spiritual layer with all kinds of beings, and the whole thing is operating under God's ultimate sovereign authority. This used to be a common way of seeing the world, but over the centuries, we got trained to put natural things in one box and supernatural things in another, and this integrated view started to feel foreign. So, what does this layered reality actually look like? In this third section, let's break down how this worldview functions and why it creates the space we need to understand our own complicated experiences. So, you can picture our reality as having three coexisting layers. At the very top, you have God's sovereign reign. That's the foundation for everything. Nothing happens outside of his ultimate control. Then in the middle, you have this idea of a contested cosmos, a spiritual environment where there are other agents, both faithful ones and rebellious ones, and they're active. And at the bottom, there's us, embodied humanity living out our fragile physical lives. And here's the key. These layers aren't sealed off from each other. They are constantly interacting and influencing one another. Okay, it's a compelling idea for sure. But you might be wondering, is it actually biblical? Where do we see this idea of multiple causes, all leading to a single event, playing out in the pages of Scripture? Well, the book of Job is maybe the perfect example of this. Just think about all the different factors that went into his suffering. There's a scene that takes place in God's heavenly counsel. There's direct hostility from a spiritual adversary. There are what we would call natural disasters. There's human violence from raiding parties. And all of that comes together to produce very real physical illness and absolutely profound psychological anguish in Job himself. See, it's not one cause or the other. It's all of them, all intersecting at once. So, if reality has all these interacting layers, what in the world do we do with that information? Section 4 is all about the practical payoff. It's about moving away from drama and simple answers and towards something called disciplined discernment. And this is so important. This worldview doesn't give you a simple flowchart where symptom A always equals cause B. Instead, it calls for something much more mature, patient, careful, disciplined inquiry. It resists that powerful urge we all have to just jump to the easiest explanation, whether that's a purely medical one or a purely spiritual one. This framework lays out 4 key areas we can look at. We can, and we should, ask about trauma, because our human experiences leave real physical marks on our bodies and our nervous systems. We can look at biology, because our bodies are real and they get sick. Physical causes are a real thing. We can also consider the possibility of spiritual deception, where hostile powers take our existing vulnerabilities and just amplify the distortion. And finally, we have to look at isolation, because being in community is a huge stabilizing means of grace, and being fragmented just makes us more vulnerable. You can see how this approach allows us to hold all of these realities together at the same time without anxiety. And that brings us to our final section, hope in a contested world. If our reality really is this complex and contested, what does that mean for our hope? Well, this framework argues that Christ's victory completely changes the game and reframes how we even think about stability and sanity. This brings up a vital question. What does Christian hope actually look like in this messy world? Well, according to this source, let's start with what it's not. It's not a promise that you'll be psychologically bulletproof or that you'll never struggle again. Hope is not the absence of a fight. Instead, hope is a stubborn, persevering trust, a kind of covenant loyalty to a king who has already won the ultimate victory over every cosmic power. And this leads us to such a powerful, reassuring summary statement. This framework acknowledges the reality of the struggle. Yes, our minds can feel like a battlefield. They are contested. But the ultimate promise of the gospel is that they are never, ever abandoned. And maybe the best way to summarize this entire framework is with this final thought. It completely reorients our definition of mental health. In a contested cosmos, sanity is not defined by the absence of struggle. It is defined by persevering trust under the reign of Christ. In this view, sanity isn't about feeling perfect. It's about where you place your trust, especially in the middle of the contest. It's about a persevering loyalty to Christ, the one who reigns supreme over every single layer of our complex reality.